nature of money. What is money? And of course, this brings in a whole further set of considerations. When you consider the political campaign of Ron Paul, and that is that gold is being advocated as a currency, while banking is being advocated as a currency. And so this would seem, at least to me, to introduce conflicting propositions. That is, how would we honor a gold standard and issue circulation beyond it? Obviously, that couldn't be redeemable in gold. So what is the prevailing principle here? How could those two things actually coexist rightly without let's say, unjustifiable ramifications, such as multiplication of indebtedness in proportion to a circulation, ultimately transferring title of all the gold to someone who no more than publishes evidence of our promissory obligations to each other. So what is the thinking of Austrian economics here? I'm wondering, is there some set of principles that predicate gold or paper money? I know Ron Paul, of course, is always objecting to fiat without raising what principles make it bad. And I'm not saying there aren't any. I am saying there are, but they're not, of course, related to the material. They're related to processes which are attached to the money, which is in effect saying what Rothbard has said, but I go much further with it in terms of an obfuscation of the currency. Nonetheless, what's the Austrian perspective of all this? How do we either separate these currencies and have a right application for the one or the other, or some combination of the both? What's the rationale for all this?
Okay, well, why don't I'll say a little piece and then let you take it from there, because I'm not sure which way you want me to go. So I think just about all Austrians would agree that if there were completely unfettered, free market where the government didn't intervene in money and banking, that what you would have is, at least in a modern industrial Western nation, that gold would be the money. So prices would actually be quoted in terms of weights of gold, and so the gold itself would be the money, the commodity money. But then for matters of convenience, you would have businesses that, and it might just be the banks themselves would do this because they would be the ones suitable to do it, that you would go and give them 10 pounds of gold, because you don't want to be carrying that around on your person. You'd be liable to get mugged and so forth. Mm-hmm. And then they might give you notes. So Citibank might give you, city notes saying 1 ounce of gold printed on this piece of paper, but that thing is fully backed by gold in their vaults, and it's a transferable note. And so you go to merchants and you pay with paper, but the reason they take those things is because they know Citibank stands prepared to give you, 1 for 1 the gold if they turn it in. So I think that's the ideal system people have in mind, and that I think that's what Ron Paul is trying to get to. That he's saying he wants to just legalize that and make it, because right now it would be hard for a bank to do that, or some sort of financial institution to do that, because they would get hit with capital gains taxes on the gold that they were keeping in storage, if for no other constraints that might be in there in terms of securities laws. So he wants to try to get all that out of the way to make it feasible for people to do that, to, in a sense, compete with the dollar.
To compete with the dollar. To me, that would pose a huge. It does two things. It would do two things. That would deny, or at least it doesn't account for, a right which might be asserted of individuals to issue their promissory obligations. And the other consideration that has to be accounted for, if this is going to resolve any issues at all, which is unclear exactly how we would get there and how it would resolve any issues, at least from that much of an explanation. We'd have to get into this much deeper. But the question would be, he's always complaining about circulatory inflation causing price inflation. So if you had a relatively fixed finite quantity of gold to back your circulation, obviously it would be impossible for us to represent our contributions to production above and beyond a finite volume of gold, unless some way is provided for doing so. Does any such way exist in Austrian economics?
If I'm misunderstanding you, just correct me. If you're saying how do we know that there's going to be enough gold to represent everything, I think the standard response is to say, well, any amount of gold can facilitate any desired transactions. It's just the prices of things quoted in weights of gold might have to go down. So like if total output in terms of goods and services doubled, then their prices quoted in gold could all get cut in half, and then the same physical amount of gold could still change hands and represent all that. Is that what you...
Actually, that's exactly what I'm saying. Is that given a finite quantity or at least a quantity which only increases moderately through the years as we mine more and more gold, being as industrial production can vacillate wildly beyond that rate of accumulation of gold, this means that, say, prior promissory commitments are subverted by the changing values which would have to exist if the value of all other things was restricted to however it divided into a relatively finite quantity of gold at any time. So Austrians just don't seem to find anything wrong with this, or what? I mean, is that supposed to be a solution for monetary rectitude? In other words, if I produce something today and I want to acquire something tomorrow, which is the equivalent of it, and I hold some currency of any kind, whether it be gold, a precious metal, or a representation of anything, preferably my very own production, and I want to acquire at some given time, later time, something of like value to me, which may be a different kind of a thing. It's of my interest that the tokenization of value is immutable, so that I am ensured that I can hold or save a representation of my wealth while somebody else has consumed of my production, so that I can consume of a like volume of production of another kind at some other time. So this obvious disparity in the volume of gold and the volume of industrial production and persisting wealth undermines or prevents even upholding such a principle. But Austrian economics has no problem with that?
Well, again, let me say that I'm speaking here for the Rothbardian types who are really committed to a pure gold standard as opposed to some of the other variants. But yeah, among the Rothbardians, I think they would say that it's true. There's no such thing, or at least gold is not a theoretically perfect money in that respect. But just practically speaking, that it sounds like what you're saying is you want the monetary unit to have a predictable purchasing power, so that you don't put some of your wealth into this thing or write contracts based on, debt contracts saying you're going to pay me 100 ounces of gold per year for the next 10 years. And then all of a sudden the purchasing power is totally different from what you were expecting.
Right.
And you regret having done that. So that's all true. But I think Austrians say that's in the nature of just subjective value in the first place, that things can change over time. And there's no such thing as a money that would guarantee you that sort of stability. And gold, for various reasons, is a lot less likely to surprise you than, for example, governments running with printing presses that are backed by nothing. So I think that would be the response.
Well, I would disagree that that's part of the subjective value of anything. That's a manipulated value as a consequence of attempting to represent the value of all things with a finite value, volume of gold or whatever else, which is disparate in volume inherently and is in transition, which isn't therefore a product of my subjective decision that gold has changed in value. This is a result of the disparity in volumes, which is constantly vacillating. So I would have to disagree with that, and I'm curious. I would think that, and I'm not trying to be argumentative here, understand, I'm just trying to get to the truth and the relevance of all this. I would think that these ideas of Rothbard would be inspired, for instance, from a motive of rectifying improprieties. I mean, why would you insist on a gold standard unless you didn't believe it served us better somehow, So I'm wondering, is there any opening in the Austrian mindset, at least amongst upper echelon intellectuals, to embrace a solution for that issue, the disparate volume of gold, as being incapable, really, of maintaining immutable value in tokenizations of production?
Well, again, everybody agrees that if the government can come along and debase the currency and prices rise 1,000 times, like that's going to totally distort things, and people are going to get their wealth transferred to those who are getting the newly printed money. But maybe it sounds like this is what you're disputing, but there is a train of thought that Mises started, and I think Rothbard and his followers picked up, is that saying that it really it's a false goal to try to say we should strive for a monetary unit that has immutable value, because ultimately value is.
I'm going to break in here again to explain a remarkable thing to those who are following along here. What Bob has said is remarkable. Here, what he's explaining is remarkable, because I'm not sure whether he actually meant to say it's a false goal, but let's just say at the time, at least, it might have been considered a too lofty goal. But the disparity in concepts here is so narrow. There is so little difference in truth between it, because what I've actually developed is a mathematic process which just preserves the natural cycle of a promissory obligation, but in so doing, in paying and retiring principal from circulation at the rate of consumption of the related property, we're maintaining a circulation which has this perpetual one-to-one-to-one relationship, therefore, which preserves the subjective value. Thus, all we're doing here is refining that concept just a tad further with something that's not a false goal, nor is any longer a too lofty goal, because it's this simple process which maintains a one-to-one-to-one relationship, which perpetually preserves in an immutable currency this one-to-one-to-one relationship, which even the Austrians regularly seek or advocate would justify gold, for instance, claiming that it would prevent inflation. Now, the only reason to prevent circulatory inflation, of course, is because it violates this one-to-one relationship between remaining circulation and remaining value of represented property, which is claimed by people such as Ron Paul, who may not be holding true to the Austrian bent even in this claim. But they're claiming that this is what's destroying the value of circulation. Well, it's recognized that this has a potentially destructive consequence, but it's not, of course, proven, nor does it exist in every case, that when you increase the circulation per goods and services, for instance, that you actually impose a like increase in the cost of production. Of course, my work's proven that the only intrinsic cause of increasing costs in the imposed systems of exploitation is instead interest. But again, so we have a